Hello and welcome to the Symposium. My name's Carl, and today I'd like to talk about causality, cause and effect. And as you can see from the picture that I have displayed there, it seems that there is a demonstrable connection between a cause and its effect, especially if you were on the receiving end of that effect. You would definitely be able to ascribe it to a definite cause. But it's actually a really ancient question because it throws into doubt how we view the world and not only our own perceptions, but the concept of the constant connections between things. It's an ancient question that has been addressed by many minds in many times. How do we establish this causal relationship between two objects? We're dealing with the following question. What sort of necessity, if any, attaches to the relation between cause and effect? Scottish Enlightenment philosopher David Hume tried to establish how we recognise cause and effect in our daily lives. He began by distinguishing between thinking and feeling, what he calls ideas and impressions. Hume believed that our impressions were direct, vivid and forceful, as in what we see through our senses, whereas ideas are faint and feeble images, as in what we hold in our minds, separate from the direct information of our senses. Hume believed that ideas were copies of impressions, and that all of our ideas were a result of our impressions. This is what makes him an empiricist. All of our ideas are generated from our impressions of the world around us, what we would call our empirical observations. Hume describes more complex ideas as compound ideas, ideas that are made up of simple components that themselves are ideas derived from impressions, even if the compound idea itself is not. He divides propositions into two broad categories: observation versus intuition. Impressions are observed propositions, the world acting upon us and instilling a particular feeling within us, whereas intuitive propositions are ones known, quote, by the mere operation of thought. Intuitively certain propositions are ones that are definitionally true, by simply understanding what has been said, whereas demonstrably certain propositions are ones that follow logically from, and thus can be proved, from intuitive propositions. And he talks about this in his Treatise of Human Nature. He lays out his theory in tracing ideas to their original impressions. From the primary impression comes the idea, and the examination of the idea provides clarity. Hume believed that cause and effect were not qualities of the objects themselves. Causation must be derived from a relation among objects. The relationship between two objects as cause and effect are what Hume describes as contiguous. These contiguous causes can create a chain of causes that link distant objects together, and Hume considers that, quote, the relation of contiguity is an essential to that of causation. Then Hume addresses the priority of time in cause and effect. In his day, some people actually believed that cause did not necessarily come before effect. But Hume establishes that this contradicts observation and is logically incoherent. Cause and effect cannot coexist, as then there would be no such thing as succession, and time itself must therefore cease to exist. After establishing the relations of contiguity and succession, Hume looks to answer the question of what is the nature of the necessary connection between cause and effect. Hume believes, first, that it is necessary for every effect to have a cause, and second, that particular causes must have particular effects, and it was up to us to discover the nature of the inferences that we draw from one to the other. Then he moves on to why a cause is always necessary, and examines the relationship between cause and effect. Though most people take for granted the notion of each effect having a cause, Hume believed that if we analyse this maxim using his idea of how knowledge is gained, which is impressions from which we derive our ideas, we find there is actually no intuitive certainty contained therein. So Hume believed that certainty arose from a comparison of ideas through a series of relations. These are resemblance, proportion, degrees of quality, and contrariety. That was a mouthful. It's not a word I use in everyday conversation. None of them are implied in the proposition, whatever has a beginning also has a cause of existence, meaning that it is not intuitively certain. Hume provides an argument that he believed shows that it is not intuitively or demonstrably certain. He says, we can never demonstrate the necessity of a cause to every new existence or modification of existence, without showing at the same time the impossibility there is that anything can never begin to exist without some productive principle, and where the latter proposition cannot be proved, we must despair of ever being able to prove the former. Hume believed that all ideas are distinct from one another. He reasons that cause and effect are also distinct. For example, we are able to conceive of an object to be non-existent at the moment and existent the next without conjoining it to the idea of a cause in our imaginations. This is a distinction that we are able to make in our imagination, and the actual separation of these objects is possible, so no contradiction or absurdity is implied. This means it cannot be refuted by mere ideas, without which it is impossible to demonstrate the necessity of a cause. Hume believed that the idea of an object cannot imply the existence of another idea of that object. At least I think that's what he's trying to say. At this point, Hume's wording is a bit confusing. As all ideas are separable, if they are distinct, the impression we form into an idea must take on a certain character. This would be our inference, and we cannot substitute this idea for another at will. Ideas presumably have to be separate, otherwise how do we know what we're even talking about? How do we know what we're thinking? This is how I believe Hume comes to the conclusion that all knowledge is derived from experience only. If we infer cause and effect from our experiences of succession and contiguity, as in the sequence of events and their apparent connections, and use these memories to predict the consequences of future events, Hume describes this as our ability to learn the conjunction of causes and effects. However, Hume believed that our ability to remember the past and reason the future was not enough to describe what had happened. He calls this new relation constant contiguity. It is not enough to have only perceived the cause and effect in a single instance. It must be a relationship that is observable in multiple instances. Hume then moves on to examining the nature of the inference we make between one object and another, and the transition from impression to idea, and how we form those necessary connections. This is framed by Hume in the question, what is our idea of necessity when we say two objects are necessarily connected together? Hume begins this process in reverse, with his inquiry into the idea of necessity requiring us to determine from which impression did it arise. He begins by identifying and examining two objects that are supposed to be in relation to one another. He perceives that one object precedes the other and that they are contiguous in time and place. There appears to be no third relation between the objects. Hume then goes on to observe multiple instances of the two objects acting in like ways to ensure that they do not give rise to a new idea. As he continues, he finds in repetition that it is not always the same, and this gives rise to new ideas that he must examine. But after frequent repetition, the mind is determined by custom to consider the effect of the cause, and more forcefully because of the effect's relation to the cause. Hume determines that it is this impression or determination that produces the idea of necessity. Our repeated experience of the thing, of the two objects acting in a predictable manner, in the same manner, by constant custom, as our mind is determined by custom, produces this idea of necessity. Hume then turns to examine the idea of efficacy. He observes that efficacy, agency, power, force, energy, necessity, connection, and productive quality are effectively synonyms that can't actually define one another. The question is, from where do we derive the impressions that give us these ideas? As reason alone cannot give rise to new ideas, the idea of efficacy must be derived from experience. Hume believed it was not any single instance that we derived the idea of cause and effect from, and the idea of efficacy between them, but from repeated experience of such a connection, something he described as a constant conjunction. The repetition of a single example cannot give rise to new ideas, only the current existing ones. New ideas must be discovered or produced from new experiences. This gives rise to the question of where the idea of necessity originates. Hume uses this opportunity to join together his arguments. He begins by defining cause, of which he has two definitions. The first is an object precedent and contiguous to another, where all the objects resembling the former are placed in like relations of precedence and contiguity to those objects that resemble the latter. The second is an object precedent and contiguous to another, and so united with it, that the idea of the one determines the mind to form the idea of the other, and the impression of the one to form a more lively idea of the other. He then seeks to set out general rules for us to understand cause and effect. Hume is attempting to locate the impression that produces the ideas of cause and effect. He believed that it could not be found in the qualities of the objects, as there are always exceptions or universal qualities that defy categorization. The terms cause and effect can't be properties of events, because we can always find other objects that meet the criteria and are unrelated to the example in question. He describes a chain of causes and events which are contiguous with one another, such as a domino run, where knocking over the first leads to the knocking over of the last. Hume believed that where we cannot identify why a distant object is apparently affected by a chain of events, we simply assume it must be there. He believed that these contiguous relationships between objects are essential to causation. And I do agree with his statement that there is no action at a distance. I find his analysis of a contiguous chain of events to be a plausible way of explaining how one event affects another. Hume then presents a second essential relation between cause and effect that he believed would be controversial. He argues that the priority of time requires the cause to come before the effect, because as I said earlier, in his day, it appears that some people actually believed it was not necessary for cause to precede effect, and instead causes and effects occurred simultaneously. Hume argues that first, common experience shows this that it is not the case, and secondly, we cannot establish that this is not true by inference. He cites the established maxim that an object cannot be the source of its own creation, but must be assisted by an outside force. He argues that if any cause may be contemporary with its effect, then all must be contemporary, and all cannot be a proper cause, as this, in Hume's view, leads to the destruction of the very idea of cause and effect, and the annihilation of time as a measurement, as all objects would be coexistent. Hume uses the maxim, whatever begins to exist must have a cause of existence. This is assumed to be founded on intuition, but Hume doubts that this is the case. He believed all certainty arose from a comparison of ideas and the relation between them. These relations are resemblance, proportions in quality and number, degrees of inequality, and contrariety, contradictions between two things. In the maxim, Hume asserts that none of these relations are implied, and so it cannot be said to be intuitively certain by his definition. It could be argued that I think therefore I am is intuitively certain, but it does not fit Hume's criteria as defined above, although it is hard to argue that further proof that one exists is needed if one is thinking. By Hume's definition, though, that maxim is not intuitively certain, but it does seem that no further evidence is needed to prove that every effect has a cause. How else could it be explained that something came into existence? This is the unanswered question regarding the origins of the universe that opens the door to the existence of God. It seems obvious that something cannot come from nothing, and therefore something must have existed before the universe. Hume demonstrates the distinctness of ideas from one another by observing that it is easy for us to imagine the existence of an object and its non-existence in the same moment without having a cause for its disappearance. We are able to distinguish between these two states as is proof to Hume that they are separable, and the ideas that follow the impressions are something we can hold in our thoughts. Hume is suggesting that our inferences about certain objects are derived from a penetration into their essences, as he puts it, that is, repeated impressions that form ideas in our minds about the connection between cause and effects that those objects produce. He believed that no object that suggests the existence of others if we do not examine the ideas which are formed by our perception. According to him, all ideas can be distinguished from one another, and if we do not examine the ideas formed from impressions, we run the risk of substituting another idea in place of the correct one, as in we might be mistaken and assume we had seen something that we had actually not. If we do not exclude the possibility of the object being something else, the inferences we assume amounts to knowledge, which they're not, they're conclusions based on reasoning. Hume is operating under two principles here, that distinct ideas are separable and that we can imagine what is actually possible. By the distinctness of two ideas, Hume means that each idea we hold can be distinguished from other ideas by our definitions and any inherent contradictions contained therein. Hume believed that the separability between cause and effect can be shown by our ability to imagine the cause or effect without imagining a conjunction between them, as in we can imagine the existence and then the non-existence of an object or vice versa, without imagining any particular causal reason that they might have appeared or disappeared. This means we can imagine the effect without imagining the cause, which Hume considers a proof of his reasoning. I'm not sure if I accept Hume's second principle. We can surely imagine something it is apparently impossible to happen, such as people beginning to fly or something, or two-headed talking animals. But the question then is, are these cases of actual impossibility, or is it simply a case that we haven't managed to create the circumstances in which these things can occur yet? Hume's reasoning seems sound, as it follows that if all of our ideas come from our impressions of reality, then any formulation of those ideas will have a grounding in reality, even if they don't come about naturally. And this would seem to dovetail with Descartes' observation that we can't think of anything truly original, just a composite of other ideas. So, can there be associations in our mind without any real regularities? And to be honest with you, I don't really see how that could be the case. It seems that Hume has established that reality conditions us in Pavlovian fashion to expect effect to follow cause because of the frequent conjunction of the two in our everyday experiences. It seems irrational to expect that there would be a way for these things to be associated in our minds without this cause and effect. If a man expected the microwave to make toast and when he put bread in the toaster, we would consider him quite mad, as this is not the association that we've come to expect through our long experience of making toast. The Humean perspective was picked up by 20th century British philosopher Elizabeth Anscombe, who wrote about Hume's treatise on human nature in her own work, Causality and Determination. She begins by addressing the assumption that there is a necessary condition in causality, and that being caused is an exceptionless generalization that declares an event to always follow a certain antecedent. This surely means that if an effect causes a certain outcome in one case and does not in another similar event, then there must be a relevant difference between them that accounts for this incongruity. According to Anscombe, any radically different account of causation must deny this assumption but grant that the assumption of relative difference is a sound principle of investigation. This radical theory, whatever it is, would not grant that it must be necessarily so that effect follows cause, given an established set of circumstances, and must do so as a general rule. After this, Anscombe details a historical list of other philosophers who have conceptualized the association between cause and effect. In Aristotle's Metaphysics, he says, one acts and one is acted upon of necessity, where rational powers is required to determine the result. Spinoza's, given a determinate cause, the effects follow of necessity, and without its cause, no effect follows. And Hobbes's, a cause is the aggregate of all the accidents of both the agents, however many soever they be, and of the patients put together, which, when they are supposed to be present, it cannot be understood but that the effect is produced at the same instant, and if any of them to be wanting, it cannot be understood but that the effect is not produced. which is a real mouthful. Anscombe argues that Hume overthrew this understanding of a logical connection by demonstrating that there is no logical contradiction between our expectations of an effect not lining up with the consequence of a cause. She uses the example of us putting a kettle of water on a stove and the water failing to boil. Hume assumed a necessary connection to be an essential part of cause and effect, and sought to understand the nature of it. He believed that this could not be found outside of the human mind, and was found in our experience of constant conjunction, that is, our repeated experience of it being true. Anscombe describes this as an event was caused is to say that its occurrence was an instance of some exceptionless generalization connecting an event with its antecedents. She interprets this to mean that Hume's ideas of causality are deterministic, with laws that always produced a predictable outcome, assuming identical conditions. She then informs us of Kant's attack on Hume's interpretation of causality as an a priori conception, and that he reinforced the connection between causation and necessity as it happens, quote, in conformity with a rule, meaning that there must invariably and necessarily be a condition of a rule that an event follows. John Stuart Mill also explained causation in terms of necessity and sufficient conditions, although these terms have been poorly defined and are subject to interpretation. This allows the interpreter to rule out the question, may not the sufficient conditions of an event be present and yet the event not take place? If sufficient conditions occur and the event does not, how is this explained? Anscombe then turns to Bertrand Russell's assault on the law of causation, which he believed had been allowed to erroneously survive because it was thought to do no harm. In his essay, which she describes as of great brilliance, Russell cast doubt upon the idea of necessity unless it was explained in terms of universality, and found that concepts of determination and consequence do not differentiate between a conceivable course of things and any other course. This means that Russell also assumed that necessity and universality are linked and are what is in question, without considering other options. At this point, Anscombe shows that it is wrong to associate universality with necessity by way of our ability to trace effect from cause as being far easier than being cause to effect. She uses the example of a person coming into contact with one person with a certain disease and then contracting it themselves. It is easy to divine the source of the disease. But if one were to ask a doctor in advance whether one would contract the disease, the doctor cannot give a certain answer. Anscombe raises the counterpoint that one could argue that this comes from a lack of knowledge about the circumstances, from which she shoots back as an assumption that there is such a thing to know. But given that we still do not have to settle this in the reverse, we can determine that the cause of contracting the disease was contact with a carrier of the disease after the fact, without having known this in advance. After arriving at this point, Anscombe observes that understanding of causality may not be necessary for knowledge of causes, using the example of statisticians and valency or long-run frequency. People handle cause and effect without understanding causation all the time. And it's here that Anscombe finally formulates her own definition of causality that she remarks appears so obvious as to become trite. Causality consists in the derivativeness of an effect from its causes. She describes this as the core, the common feature of causality in its various kinds. Effects derive from and arise out of, come from, their causes. In this, she is effectively shifting away from the causes to the effects as the primary focus of the discussion. Although I have to say, it seems that the predictive power of this formulation does seem to be wanting somewhat. But she uses the example of the conception of life, where the physical coupling is the causal relation. The derivation is material by fission. This bypasses the need for necessity or universality. The necessity is the laws of nature, through which we will derive our knowledge of the effect from knowledge of the cause or vice versa, but that does not show cause as the source of the effect, meaning that causation is not to be identified with necessitation. Anscombe then analyzes the logic of her proposition. If A comes from B, it does not imply that every A-like thing comes from some B-like thing, or that every B-like thing has an A-like thing coming from it, or that given B, A had to come from it, or that given A, there had to be a B for it to come from. Any of these may be true, but they would be an additional fact outside A coming from B. She believed that if we interpret coming from in the sense of travel, that's because this becomes evident. At this point, she returns to the Humean argument, that we only know this because it can be observed, and that we can't similarly observe causality in the individual case, but by the constant conjunction of the cause and effect. Anscombe addresses this in 2 points. First, she dismisses the argument of all we find is X, as the arguer has excluded from their expectations the finding of the sorts of things they do not expect to find. She further presses the point by applying Hume's own logic of impressions against the Humean argument by arguing that we do not know of a billiard ball in motion, but instead the successive impressions of a white patch in our visual system, etc., reducing the Humean account of causality to an argument about our perceptions and not occurrences in the real world outside of our heads. This goes outside of the logic of Hume's own description of causality as being perception-based, and Anscombe presses the case even harder by reducing it even further with the question, how did we come by our primary knowledge of causality? And her answer is that we learned the linguistic representation and application of a host of causal concepts, rendering us trapped in the very language we use to understand anything about the subject. She uses the example of the word infect, which she thinks is not a description as much as it is a causal hypothesis, going as far to observe that cause itself is a very general word. How do we demonstrate that we have the concept of cause beyond showing it to be in our vocabulary? This presupposes the mastery of much else in language. She gives the hypothetical that the word cause could be added to a language that already contains causal concepts, such as scrape, push, carry, burn, etc., things that have an action and effect. But if our hypothetical language had no such words, then cause could only be added to that language without any inherent meaning. Using causal verbs is part of learning to apply concepts referring to the substances that these verbs are derived from, fire, burn, etc. Anscombe refutes Hume's appeal to Cartesian skepticism when he challenges us to produce some instance wherein the efficacy is plainly discoverable to the mind and its operations obvious to our consciousness or sensations. She queries, is cutting, is drinking, is purring not efficacy, before addressing Hume's point that it is true that we might be deceived by false appearances, where one impression is substituted for a false one, and she believes that Hume wanted us to produce an instance in which efficacy is related to sensation as red is. She agrees that we cannot do that because it is not so related in that way. Her second response is to address the dangers of universal generalizations, to supply that which in an individual case does not, as the needed examples are not very common. She uses Hume's example of billiard balls in motion again, and focuses on the narrowness of the example as applied only to other billiard balls, and not to something like a stone wall. She observes that neo-Humeans are more cautious in this regard, that if you propose always given an A, B follows, rarely produces anything that's true. One must describe an absence of circumstances in which A does not cause B, which becomes a mammoth and unachievable task. Anscombe then gives us an example of laws of nature to inform her proposition. If we say that there is a law of nature that goes, the flashpoint of a substance is X, it is important to explain why a struck match becomes lit. It's not a generalization which would be always if a substance reaches X temperature, it ignites. The correct formulation would be, if a sample of such substance is raised to such a temperature and does not ignite, there must be a cause for it not doing so. This reversal of the way that Hume was looking at it avoids such generalizations like always, in which there may be cases where the expected effect doesn't occur. Unlike the generalization, this formulation is probably never going to end up being inaccurate. But again, I must say, I don't think this is going to have tremendous predictive power, which I think is at the heart of us trying to work out cause and effect and the constant conjunction of these things, so we might know what our actions are going to do in advance, at least within a reasonable limit. But Anscombe returns to her medical example to show that this is all academic. Medicine is not concerned with cataloguing a vast list of circumstances in which people fall ill, even if this is the incorrect philosophical framing. So we return to our wrestlers. I don't think it's going to be possible that you can persuade that the incorrect logic and the faulty philosophy behind our general and daily layman ideas of cause and effect will persuade him that, in fact, the reason he's getting his arm twisted out of his socket by his fellow wrestler is not because he has just lost the match to this wrestler.